we could clearly see how people's life standards have been improved. This exhibition is such an event to memorize 40th anniversary of reform and opening up. And all of those 300 items were offered by the local people. And about January next year, when this exhibition comes to an end, all of those items will be returned to the local people who contributed in the first place. Actually, you could see the arrangement here. We basically have restored the look in 40 years ago in their houses. It feels antique, right? And this one exhibition we are now standing is about the first several years in reform and opening up. And also, we are honored to have invited Professor Yan from this exhibition to help us look deeper into those items. Good afternoon. I am actually a viewer of our CCTV. Mr. Bai, thank you for coming. As I said, basically we put all of those items according to their original look 40 years ago. Those items were in the beginning years of reform and opening up, when we were transitioning. And as you know, in the 1970s, we were in shortage of materials. So back then, we were transitioning the whole country. And the shortage of materials would certainly mean that some of those furnitures will have to pass on for generations to come. For example, this square table and those chairs, those were old stuffs. They actually came from the Ming and Qing dynasty and were passed on for the 1970s. After all, in those years, we were in urgent need of any object. So usually those stuffs will have to be used for many generations, and they're more better reserved. If at that time people want to make some new furniture, where can we get those materials? In the 1970s, we were governed by planned economy. All of those materials would have to be approved by the national agency. For example, the allocation of wood would have to get the permission from the central government. In the rural areas, some people may plant trees in their yards. For example, they may plant 10 trees, and then they could use the trees to build their frames of the windows, of doors, or their columns and beams. In the urban areas, those residents would not have such trees for raw materials. Then they would have to get approval from the agency to distribute those materials. Also, Professor, as you said, those furniture were the stuffs in the planned economy when Chinese people didn't have so many abundance. And let's look inside. What is this box used? I think this is used for storing stuffs. It's quite simple. The Chinese people back then don't want to package them in different layers or in different packages. They just throw all of the stuff into this box. Exactly. This cabinet, it's the same thing. They don't have different drawers or different layers inside. They put all of their luggages inside or their clothes, whether for winter or for summer, and they throw them all in. But now we usually hang our clothes and divide them into different categories like summer clothes or winter clothes. But that's a totally different story back then. After all, people were in shortage of furniture, and people think utility comes first in those times. We could see those stuffs were put aside exactly as they looked like in the early days of reform and opening up. What about those paintings hanging on the wall? Those were framed with glasses, and as to the paintings themselves, we call them glass painting. Why? Because you could see that on the surface of the painting, they are glass, and the photos and the characters were imprinted on the glass. You cannot scrap them. And on the back of the glass, the characters were usually written from backward. So when we turn them aside, they would look exactly the way it should be. And as you know, writing those calligraphies here on the glasses are quite difficult. Guo Dianyuan was a master in painting such glass painting. That was quite an invention. It's as difficult as painting the snuff bottles. As you know, the glass paintings were in their golden times during the 1930s and 1940s. And then in the 1970s, after reform and opening up, people were used to hang paintings, such paintings like glass paintings, on the wall because such glass paintings would look very pretty, and they're not that easy to be broken compared to the others. They would write something representing good fortune, like live a long life, on the walls. That showcased people's aspiration for a better life. I heard that at that time people had some local customs. For example, they value some smaller objects like a bicycle, watches, and sewing machines. And also, another one is the radio. Those four objects were like the must-haves for the wealthy families. And usually those objects, like radios, were taken as very valuable furniture. If one family could have such a radio, then it's not a small deal. Usually they could invite a lot of children after they got off class to come to their home and listen to the radio and listen to the sounds coming from the radio. They felt quite excited. And sometimes those small children would just sing along, even though they're not professional singers, but they were happy. And let's look at this table. It's quite narrow. I think that's because in that time, people don't have that much objects to put on the table. That's why the table don't have to be very big or broad. Exactly. Those narrow tables used to be used to put on some bottles and not many more. But now, since we do not have such old bottles or ornaments, people then put some quite good-looking things on the outside. For example, such slogans like "depending on yourself and work hard." And people would also choose to put their radios, clocks, like this one, on this narrow table. The things put on the narrow table are usually quite important because the narrow table is quite tall and the small children could not reach those objects on top of the narrow table. That's why most of the objects placed on the narrow table were quite valuable. In that way, the parents could reduce damage caused by the children. As you said, in the 1970s and 1980s, since the Chinese people were in a transitioning period, for an ordinary family, Is that clock such a frequently seen object to keep track of the time? Actually, no. Usually it was the wealthier family that could have access to such a clock. Because after all, we have a quota system in place to get objects like this. I remember that it takes like 7 days to have such one clock. And people may buy such a clock. For example, this one, the brand is Bendy. And let's take it and have a closer look. Days ago, we checked on this clock, and I listened to some interpretation of this clock. For example, let's look inside. Could you see that something is rolling inside? The gear is still turning. And I was also told about how to use them. You just firstly open this cover, and then you turn this button. By turning this button, you could set the exact hour for the clock to speak and to give a warning about the time. Could you hear some clicking sound? The sound is quite big and obvious. And also the clock is not made of some usual wood. It's actually made of boxwood. And that's about the clock. Now let's look at this table. We could see the pot, the cups used for drinking tea. And also this one is made of iron cover. It's made to keep warm the water inside. It's called a thermos. People love drinking water from those thermos, and I was told that such a thermos used to be made for making a movie in 1964. But in that moment, in the years like 1964, such thermos were rare objects. I heard that that movie team has went around several households to get one such thermos. This is another good example of the old times object. I sensed that almost every household in that days have such a counting frame. It's called abacus. Abacus. And at that time, people would basically rely on such an abacus to do some calculation. After all, they didn't have the nowadays digital objects or electronics products. This is another one. When our workers have to work outside, they have to prepare their own food, their meals, so they have such a takeaway. Such a takeaway box would be used for storing their food for the whole day. And also, it's quite simple. They don't have separated layers or after all, at that moment, they have very few objects. They would cook some simple food and take a spoon or a pair of chopsticks with them, and then they put on such a cover and they take this takeaway box. And in their working place, usually they have a heating place to warm up their food again in the daytime. Usually in the cafeteria of the working place, they have specifically prepared such a heating place, usually to steam up those food again for their workers. in case they eat cold food. Could you introduce to us a bit more about this one? This is something unique and typical of Xingtai. Actually, this thing is made of willow. It's called 簸箕. It's usually used to screen our grains, our millets. For example, when you're moving this thing, the millets would be sticked to the surface of the willow, and for the other substances, they would be thrown away automatically. So we could automatically separate the different components and throw away the dust. In the springtime, we could get such willows, but in the first place, those willows were soft. And in the wintertime, if you get the branches of willows, they are harder. And then you could make with those willows. Could I say like this, since Xingtai has a lot of such willows and the willow branches are quite optimal for making such an object, so that's why you had a lot of those things to screen your millets. Yes, you could say that. In different counties like Pingxiang, those counties were quite close to the riverside, so along the riverside there will be a lot of willow trees. That's why almost every household would make such a thing on their own. And it's very tough. You could use this for a long time. We could call it a dustpan. And on the brim, you could see it's a little bit aging. That means it's at least 30 years old. And still, even with such a long history of usage, you could still feel it's very hard. According to Mr. Bai, we have reviewed the history of several objects placed here. For example, the old clock, you have to turn this button so that the clock may tell time at a fixed time. And usually when you turn this button, how long could this clock work? I think it may last for 3 to 4 times. So they would exhaust the turning right so that the clock could work as long as possible. Yes, that's like the power engine of this clock. Only when you turn it to its utmost level could the clock work properly. It's not an electronic one, it's mechanical, so you have to turn this with your own hand. If we fully load this clock, how many days could the clock work right now? If right now those type of clocks could work properly for 15 days. But what about those old times? No, not that long. If you turn for several rounds, they may last several hours. And also different clocks may be different because the spring inside the clock may be different. If the spring is shorter, then it may work shorter times. So by that it means it may require different turning rounds with different lengths of the spring. Now let's keep walking. This is also made of willow. Willow is quite bendy, so you could actually fold the willow branches at this turning area. That is the technique of willow making and weaving. Another type of round-shaped chair is also made of willow branches. In springtime, like I said, the willow branches are quite soft. After all, Xingtai has rich water resources and willow trees could be found everywhere, and willow trees usually grow very fast. So after you chop it, the willow trees would quickly grow again. Usually the willow trees could grow as thick as the leg of the chair within only 2 to 3 years. So we have a lot of such resources. Those resources are like inexhaustible. Is this the place where the mirror is supposed to be placed? Exactly. This is the area to place the soup. The soap. Yes, this is supposed to be a dresser. Nowadays, we are also using a dresser. They don't have such a tube for the water to run inside. This is the wash bowl, but the wash bowl is placed on the wood structure. Of course, for the wash bowl, they have different choices of materials like stainless steel or ceramics. For that wash bowl, in the old times, people don't have a lot of hot water, so they may have to use the thermos to pour water into this water basin. What about this umbrella? Is this umbrella the common one in those old days? This umbrella is produced in southern China. It's called butter umbrella. It's usually made in cities like Shaoxing City. They have different logos. As to the materials used for this umbrella, it's made of canvas. And on top of the canvas, there will be a coating of the tung oil, which is a wood oil, so that will make it tougher. Compared to the modern umbrellas, this umbrella may be heavier. But it will not be broken in the strong winds. So this is about all the objects and items within a usual household in the 1970s and 1980s. Here is one old bicycle. In the 1970s and 1980s, for the common people, such a bicycle would be very important transportation channel. That's why you would see all of those metals here on the bicycle are quite solid, and they can carry heavy stuffs. Yes, such a bicycle could carry both passengers and other objects. That's the key. One bicycle is one of the 4 major objects people could have. For this one bicycle, they have 2 such beams, such poles. With 2 poles, they could carry heavier stuffs on the back. If it is 1 pole, it could also work. Usually when they carry their family members, they could carry 2, one in front and one sitting on the back. For example, here the painting are peeled off a little bit, but usually it was the children sitting in the front, and if they have other packages or luggages, they could put them on the back. Also, every month people have to go to the stations to get their grains, and if there are a lot of bags of grains, they could put them both on the front and on the back, and it's very stable. And as I said, usually they have 2 bearings on the back. And usually for the bicycle to be stationed steadily, they would also have something to support the bicycle in the bottom. So those are special features in that special time. Here, this is the brake. Once the bicycle hits the wall, such a braking system could bear the thrust. So if we look at the functions of the bicycle and we compare the functions of such a bicycle with those of the modern bicycles, there seems to be no big difference. But if we look at the materials and the outlook, they are totally different. We had a great improvement based on such an old bicycle. At those times, bicycle cannot be bought even if you have a lot of money. It requires a stamp, a coupon to buy a bicycle. We have three major brands: Feige, Fenghuang, and Yongjiu. Feige belongs to Tianjin, and as to Fenghuang, Phoenix, as well as Yongjiu, those two brands are lighter. They're smaller in size, but as I said, Feige was produced in Tianjin in northern China. Usually, Feige bicycles will mainly be used to carry a lot of heavy stuff. For example, this one bicycle is product of Feige brand. Usually, for the modern bicycles, they are lighter, and they don't have such a beam in the front. Yes, children may have to jump a little bit in order to get on board. In the end of 1980s and in early 1990s, there's another item is also frequently used. And this one corner showcases the outlook of those household arrangements in the early 1990s. For example, this cabinet is different from the previous one. It includes already two different layers and also a drawer. Yes, it looks nicer and also with more functionalities. You could put some basic necessities here, like salt and oil here. As to the items put on top, they're also a little bit different from the early days of the reform and opening up. For example, this one radio is more advanced. You could put the tapes inside the radio. So with the economic growth and people's livelihood has been improved, people started to have some choices. For example, this thermal is a little bit different from the previous one. It's lighter when I took it, and also the outside layer is made of plastic. This table is another example. This is the most popular table in the 1980s. It looks more beautiful. For example, the leg is not straight. If the leg is straight, of course, it could carry heavier objects. But if it's oblique, it would look more fashionable. It's not dull anymore. So with those radio and such tables and televisions, we would know what the life was like in the 1980s and 1990s. I have tried to play on this radio. Some of the functions cannot work normally as before. This is the fan. It's much heavier than the trophies. A rough estimation. What is the weight? Above 10 Jin. Because they are made of copper. Now the fans are usually made of aluminum, so that's why the weights would be different. Such old fans cannot give out very big winds, but it's quite stable and it's working. Could we connect the power? Now let's wait for the power and have a look at the other items first. Those are washing machines and refrigerators. In those times, buying such home appliances like washing machines would be quite difficult. I have seen some photos of those old stuffs. Basically, such electronic appliances were made of green color. They're not very colorful. It's quite simple. So utility was the basic measurement of everything in those times. This is drying. If they could have such a drying functionality in their machine, then that family would be very wealthy. The power is on, so you could see the fan, it could still work. Some of those buttons don't work anymore. Now let's hear the sound of this fan. It's not very noisy, so let's look at this photo. And let's move this photo close to the fan to see the wind. Basically, the wind from the fan could actually put the two pieces of paper together. And we could see the photo is shaking. Another big machine in those times were the sewing machines. Because unlike today, they couldn't go to the market to buy a lot of clothes, so usually they would buy cloth from the market and then make clothes by themselves. Even they made their own beddings on such a sewing machine. Sewing machine actually is a witness of the frugality of Chinese households in those times. Almost every household would make their own clothes, or at least they have to put the patches on the worn-out clothes by themselves. You could, of course, fold this sewing machine, and here in this jar, they put a lot of stuffs, tools inside. This is the needle. You have an instruction paper here. Let's flip through this instruction pamphlet. You could see how those usual household treasures such a big sewing machine. Many things are still left with them. They value the sewing machine a lot. It's empty inside. Actually, this could be used as a usual table, and let's trample a little bit with our foot. Sewing machine is also one of the big threes. When the young couple get married, usually they would have to buy the big three first. Otherwise, the bride could choose not to marry this guy. Of course, sewing machine must be bought with food stamp or the coupon. From the early days of reform opening up until 1980s and early 1990s, this is how the general household would look like in Xingtai city. Also, the pop music has changed. In the early 1990s, Deng Lijun became a very famous singer and star. Those are some of the novel books. People don't have a lot of options of entertainment in those days. Usually they read such novels. One good thing about such smaller books is that basically all of those stories of the slangs and histories could be included in such small books. For example, this one is about some famous Chinese generals. We usually draw a lot of pictures, and with those pictures and the characters, people would have vivid review of the history. It's a very good thing. According to Mr. Bai, in the planned economy, a lot of things have to be bought with the coupons. Now let's look at those coupons. Let's pick several. This is the household registration. Yeah, you could see this one was actually used by someone. I will not read the information inside. This is the food stamps and certificate. The vegetable farmers are quite special. They live in the peripheral areas of the urban areas, and they live by planting and selling the vegetables. So those group of farmers would have their special certificate of getting the oil and other food necessities. And this one certificate is targeting the vegetable farmers. They would use such a certificate to get food. This is the registration table. I remember that usually they have a set proportion about how many grains in what category could they get. For the market circulation, usually they use such food stamps. This one is such an example. It's specifically for Hebei province. On it, it says 1 jin of grains, and on the back, you could see some instructions. It says that you could get grains or oil with this coupon in Hebei province, but it's not gonna be useful if you go to Beijing. But this one is different. It's called National Food Stamp. So by that it means you could use this stamp anywhere you go in China. And also, such a coupon would have larger proportion of the refined grains. If someone get like 2 liang of the food stamp, they would get very excited. This is the camera. So could you give us more information about the role of the camera? Like I said, there were the big threes and The fourth one, ranking next to the big three, is the camera. This is the front. As you know, if you take a photo with this camera, usually it would give out a sound like a click. So usually we call the big three, and then another big thing is called the click. So that's referring to the camera. In the beginning, those cameras were like as big as those other appliances, but then for convenience, people may need to carry such a camera when they are on business trip or on a vacation, so the cameras were made smaller. In the 1980s and early 1990s, telephones started to go popular in the households. Do you still remember the look of the camera in Xingtai in 1980s? And also, what about the numbers of the phone number? In the beginning, we have only 4 figures in a telephone number. So 4 figures, like starting with a 6 or starting with a 2. I remember that Chaoxi district has a number starting with a 2. In the early 1990s, this one cellular cell phone got very popular. It cost like 10 to 20,000 RMB yuan. With this cellular cell phone, many people have been able to use such a communication system when they are on mobility. This is the BB machine. The screen could show us the telephone number. So those are about the mobile telecommunication system back then. Of course, now it's much better with our smart cell phones, with a lot of apps. Basically, one mobile phone could solve all of the problems. It's not just about communication. Now we are moving to the year of 1998, the year before 2000. So now we could see the inside of the house. With better living standard, people started to have more entertainment options. Yes, in their furnitures and designs inside, people start to pay attention to comfort and the outlook, so they started to buy lower sofas and lower furnitures. And televisions have been switched from the black and white televisions to the colored televisions, and the size started to go larger. They are playing the games on the TV. Exactly. We could see people started to pay attention to not only the functionalities and utilities, but also personalized requirements from those home appliances. For example, aesthetics taste. This one is the most recent times, 2008. I think it looks quite familiar to our house. In the early 21st century, people start to pay attention to enjoying their life and leading a healthier life. Yes, in different era, people have different pursuits.
跟大家介绍一下啊，就是咱们这个08年之后的这个展厅，其实它的后面就是咱们这个70年代到80年代。
For your information, actually, next to the exhibition booth of 2008, that was the booth for the 1970s and 1980s. Those two booths are standing on opposite of each other, so that was a stark contrast. We could see over the past 40 years, people's lives have been transformed a great deal in China. Just now we took a round turn, and a lot of visitors are also coming here to experience how people's lives have been changed in the past 4 decades. We are now in Qiaodong district of Hebei province. By watching those must-have items of the past 40 years, we could look back at those early days. Maybe those were our childhood. Those items would be reminiscent of a lot of old memories. So that's about all of today's live broadcasting. Thank you for watching. See you.